Megan, good to see you. How are you doing? It's great to have you on today.
Doing great. It's amazing, as always, how quickly the year zooms past us.
Yeah, you're telling me. Well, I mean, thank you very much for joining us on the Investor Insights today. Obviously, the last time we saw you was in Houston last month, where you guys picked up in Investor of the Investor of the Year award at the assembly. So it's been a good year for you, and look forward to catching up and hearing some of those highlights. But I think I wanted to I guess zone in on a couple of comments that you or takeaways from your recent white paper that you published earlier in the year. I know it was titled Why Net Zero Should Be the Standard for the E&P Sector. I know that's been a key theme for you guys at Kimmeridge, particularly with your whole thesis around the reformation of the E&P sector. And I think one thing that really stood out to me was your comment around how most people want the same thing, which is reliable energy at the lowest possible cost with a net zero carbon footprint. So my question to you, just to kick us off, is how can E&P and traditional energy companies be part of the solution, and what is the path to becoming a responsible energy company?
Yeah, Ben, thank you for the opportunity to share our perspectives on the energy transition and the E&P sector. The North Star for the sector has ebbed and flowed over time, for better or worse. And today, I'd submit that the North Star is made up of three pillars: returns, runway, and readying for the energy transition. And the events over the last year or so have reinforced that we all want the same thing: energy security and affordability. We also want energy that is sustainably sourced. And I think that's the value proposition for the sector today. If we can have net zero oil and gas production, and it's all the things we need it to be: abundant, affordable, and reliable, then why shouldn't it be part of the long-term energy supply mix? Because disallowing fossil fuels stands to increase energy costs, decrease energy reliability. So if E&Ps set ambitious net zero targets, then they're strengthening the case to be part of the climate solution and a sustainable source of energy supply. So how do companies lean into that? I think we start with acknowledging that we don't have all of the answers today, but we know what our mission is, and it's to lower emissions to net zero. So it's critical for companies to establish an emissions baseline, understand what the sources of emissions are. Oftentimes it's the 80-20 rule, where 20% of your sources are contributing to 80% of your emissions. Assess the cost and phasing, the time sequencing of addressing your emission reduction plans, and feed that into the organization's target setting process.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think, again, something that I'm interested to, I guess, build on your comments there is actually how the industry can get more serious or convince investors and society more broadly that it's serious about this net zero journey. And I think in the white paper, you mentioned that efforts to date by industry leaders to reduce the industry's environmental footprint have been inconsistent, difficult to compare between different companies in both the public and the private sectors. And it's certainly something that comes up in a huge amount of conversations that we're having with investors and operators across our network. So I guess my question to you is, how do industry leaders improve transparency around existing net zero targets and develop a clear understanding of the pathways and the timelines for both themselves and their investors to achieving net zero or decarbonisation?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to approach this question. I think one is just thinking holistically about the industry in general and how they can improve the perception of the companies and their commitment to to being part of the climate solution. And I think it's really a time under tension. It's indicating what you want to do and executing it, and being transparent about what it is you're setting out to do, the pathway to getting there, and your journey. And I think this applies to a lot of different things beyond net zero. It applies, of course, to net zero, but also biodiversity ambitions and safety ambitions as well. So be transparent, recognize that not every year is going to be perfect. Not every year is going to play out as forecasted, and that's okay. Tell the story and execute. Drive accountability by incorporating milestones into long-term incentives. So that's just kind of a broad stroke response on how the industry can prove its seriousness. I think with respect to net zero specifically and improving transparency around existing net zero targets, our analysis of emissions performance data across the universe of 35 plus E&P companies illustrates this point. Methane emissions were reported using 6 different units of measurement, and a review of methane intensity metrics is even more confounding, with companies using as many as 9 different variations. And the reporting frameworks that have been developed by AXPC and API are well designed and well informed. And these were processes that were very collaborative with stakeholders from across all the logical constituencies, banks, regulators, and investors. And so I think they're incredibly useful along with the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board's frameworks. So I'd encourage companies to use these templates to help improve emissions benchmarking and incorporate that into their net zero commitments as well.
Brilliant. And I think you started to allude on it there, but what are the problems? And it's something that I read in the white paper that you published, which I found very interesting. I think we always focus on the standards that exist in the market and how operators should be reporting. But are those standards the right standards? I mean, what is wrong with current net zero frameworks for the energy sector?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's a void of disclosure frameworks in the marketplace that would provide constructive guidance for setting net zero targets for the energy sector. The current guidance assumes that E&Ps will manage the decline of their producing assets or pursue a new business model altogether. In fact, the SBTI no longer accepts commitments or validates targets for the oil and gas sector. We don't think this is the right way to think about net zero for E&Ps. Compelling E&Ps to abandon their core business to validate their net zero commitments stands to raise the cost of capital for E&Ps, further reduce energy investment and supply, and increase energy costs and undermine the sector's emission reduction efforts. And the important role that the sector can play in fighting climate change. So our position is that instead of saying that E&Ps should stop being E&Ps, we believe E&Ps should prioritize net zero in the near term.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, we could probably talk about that for hours to come, but I'm mindful of time, and there's some other things I want to put to you as well. And I think something that again was interesting from your white paper was how you looked into A&D strategies and the role that A&D strategies can play in achieving net zero or decarbonizing the sector more broadly. And again, we hosted our World Energy Capital Assembly last week, and I think one of the key takeaways was actually the unintended consequences of a bad A&D strategy. And it's not just a case of let's blindly divest carbon-intensive assets to other operators because they may fall into the hands of private operators who maybe aren't required to disclose on this type of information, report on sort of the work that they're doing to improve environmental standards. And I think as well, something that was very interesting from that meeting was actually the role that partnerships have to play within the industry, and actually say JVs, and how operators who have experience in improving emission standards, etc., how they can share that experience and best practice with those operators and even regions that may not have access to those technical or capabilities and expertise. So my question to you is, what role do acquisitions and divestitures have to play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And how do different players come together to ensure alignment and commonality in the end goal?
Yeah, I've actually had experience on both the asset acquisition and disposition side of this. And so I recall working for Concho Resources when ConocoPhillips acquired the company. And when ConocoPhillips made that announcement, it actually said it strengthened their path to aligning their business strategy with the Paris Climate Agreement. And I thought that was a really novel approach to highlighting the merits and the scalability of a transaction. It wasn't so much, or in addition to talking about the financial accretion, it spoke to the environmental accretion of the transaction. And you fast forward to working on this side of the table, and we're observing the opportunity to acquire assets that have high methane and emissions intensity, and the ability to fold them into our portfolio and take the things that we've learned from other aspects of our business, for example, Civitas being the first net zero producer in Colorado, leveraging what we learn on the public and private side of our portfolio to improve asset emission performance. I think the most important thing is it all comes back to accountability. Are we just moving emissions from one bucket to another? And asset acquisitions can drive scale and enable the sharing of best practices and mitigating and eliminating GHG emissions. Company boards and management teams should consider the environmental impact of acquiring assets and the path to reducing absolute emissions across the new combined portfolio. Conversely, asset sales can be an efficient means for shrinking the emissions profile. And there really isn't anything that I know of that the industry is working on to make sure that these assets don't fall off the industry's GHG emissions ledger. So I think one solution is having the seller disclose absolute GHG and methane emissions attributable to asset sales. I think it's a good start, but it also comes down to who are the buyers of high carbon intensity assets? Who are the capital providers? And are the capital providers encouraging responsible development and emissions reductions through due diligence process and performance hurdles?
Again, there's so much that we could draw on there, but I want to also come on to something else that you covered in the white paper, and I really do recommend that people listening in or watching into this today go and check it out, because it's a very insightful and interesting read. But I just want to touch on the role of carbon offsets. And I mean, what role do carbon offsets play? What role will they play in helping E&P companies to achieve net zero? So what are the key considerations that E&P companies have to take into account when integrating carbon offsets into their net zero plans? And I mean, where do they begin? I think that's one of the key questions that we get asked from E&P companies. They don't understand what the practical first steps are they need to take, or how to go about incorporating these into forecasting, etc.
Yeah, carbon offsets will play an important role in financing the energy transition. And for an E&P company developing their path to net zero, there will be near and medium-term solutions for mitigating and avoiding emissions. We oftentimes hear this referred to, and we refer to it as the low-hanging fruit. It's, for example, EQT replacing all of their pneumatics. But for the high-hanging fruit, the sector's most hard to abate, most costly emissions, carbon offsets can facilitate meeting net zero targets. And I would say that the offset market is growing rapidly, and the protocols and standards are quickly following. This will improve both transparency and confidence in the offset market. And at the heart of these protocols is a focus on monitoring, reporting, verification, and certification rules to ensure that offset projects perform as they were predicted during the project design. And I think companies will need to apply, so E&P companies will need to apply the same rigor, the same mindset when evaluating the offset projects. And so key considerations for integrating carbon offsets into net zero plans include asking questions like, what are the current and anticipated future costs of purchasing the offsets? Is the carbon mitigation potential of the underlying project measurable? Will the carbon removal project be third-party verified? I think also we believe the market will gravitate towards high quality offsets with true additionality. And so to Kimmeridge, this means focusing on offsets with the following traits: additionality, is it verifiable, and the permanence. And so when you put all of those things together and you approach it just as you would approach an investment in any other project in the portfolio, I think applying that rigor will help the company understand the role that offsets can play, how it can be a bridge on the net zero commitments as we work on the moonshots to tackle those hard to abate emissions in the meantime.
Brilliant. Thanks, Megan. Well, again, as I say, there's so much to delve into and sort of unpack here. And we just unfortunately don't have the time. So we'll have to get you at our next gathering, and maybe at the New York Stock Exchange in May next year. So, but no, thank you for taking the time to share those insights with us. When we push it out, I'll be sure to share a link to the white paper as well, so listeners can go and check that out. As I said, I think it's a very interesting read and one worth checking out. So no, thank you for the time, and always good to catch up.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Thanks for allowing me to spend some time highlighting Kimmeridge's approach to net zero and how we're thinking about it for the sector. And thank you also for all of the work that the Energy Council is doing. We really appreciate all of the insights that you share and the connections that you deepen. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.